Sarah Gorrell, broadcasting live from Newhaven Fort. It is just so inspiring to see some of the exhibitions here, seeing history brought to life. And we'll talk more of that. We sent those children off to one of the exhibitions and they're going to come back and tell us exactly what they made of them. And we've been talking about the children during the war. Many of you have been getting in touch who were children and sharing your memories. And there is a book which focuses very much on this. It's called Blitz Kids. It's a new book by Lewis author Duncan Barrett, and it sees the war through children's eyes. And Duncan joins me on the line. Duncan, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
Very moving putting this book together, some of the stories that unfolded, and actually we've heard a lot of them from our listeners who say this was just their normality. They thought nothing of it, playing in bomb sites, not knowing whether their home was going to be there in the morning. There must have been some incredible stories that you unearthed.
Absolutely, yeah, and the whole breadth really of childhood experiences in a way. I mean, going into the research for this book, I sort of assumed it would all be gloom and doom and misery. And, there were some really shocking stories of parents who were killed, grandparents, pets. Quite a lot of kids lost their pets, very tough at a young age. But also just that kind of resilience and that ability to make the best of things and that kind of childish innocence in a way to, see a bombed out house and think, oh, here's a great new playground, and kind of get through it one way or another and have a childhood despite the worst possible situation.
And of course, there's things like chasing those American GIs for chocolate and chewing gum.
Oh yeah, yeah. A lot of positive stories about those. I interviewed a lady in Southampton actually, where obviously there were a lot of GIs there in the build up to D-Day, and she did very well out of them.
And what were the things that really stood out for you? I mean, I know that quite often when you spoke to people many, many years on, those memories were still very, very alive and brought back some real emotions.
They were, yeah, and you do have to be conscious, I suppose. You are kind of asking people to, in some cases, relive trauma or, bring up their trauma. I mean, I spoke to a woman in Coventry who survived a really apocalyptic raid there, very much kind of by the skin of her teeth. She and her mum had just nipped out to get some dinner when the raid started. So they ended up going into a shelter, into the basement of a pub, basically, the nearest kind of safe place they could find, and then went back the next morning to find their house had been kind of completely obliterated. So you're kind of conscious, you are asking people to talk about quite difficult things. And a lot of the people I interviewed, one thing that was quite interesting was repeatedly they would say, oh, we weren't scared at the time, we just got on with it, it was all fine. But then quite a lot of them actually later in life did start to develop symptoms of what I think we would recognise as PTSD. So the lady in Coventry, for example, I mentioned, she had a kind of panic attack in a lift because it brought on this kind of claustrophobia from sheltering in the war years. Other people had, reactions to, there was a guy, for example, who went to a museum exhibit about the war 50 years later, and he thought he was completely fine. He actually told me he'd really enjoyed the war years, playing on the bomb sites and so on. But as soon as he heard the sound of the air raid siren, he said he just had to get out, and he ran straight out the museum and couldn't go back in. So I think we shouldn't underestimate, as much as there was that spirit of resilience and that kind of, the Blitz spirit and the Blitz kids spirit, these were experiences that left a lasting impact on this generation.
You shared one very moving story of Pat, who now lives in Clacton-on-Sea, and her cousin was almost killed, and she still remembers clearly seeing the aftermath of a horrible bombing raid.
She does, yeah. This was sort of towards the end of the war, so after the Blitz proper, for Londoners in particular, and other people in the south as well, because they passed over the doodlebugs, the V1s, and one of those came down, and basically, yeah, her cousin was kind of almost caught up in it. He was with a woman at the time who was badly injured as a result of this V1 going off. But these were just, the scale of these explosions is kind of hard to get your head around in a way. And they actually went afterwards to sort of go and have a look at the damage. So they went to the crater that had been left, and she actually saw, various bodies being pulled out, including a child about her own age, which I think for her, was obviously a real eye-opener. And then obviously her mum kind of realised maybe this wasn't the place to be taking the kids. But so, yeah, kids, I mean, they experienced really tough things, and also they witnessed a lot of quite shocking things that would stay with them.
And today, of course, 80 years ago today, there would have been huge celebration. VE Day. So many of those that you spoke to must have had very, very strong and clear recollections of this day 80 years ago.
They did, absolutely. I mean, the party to end all parties, you know, not just for the adults who were kind of, you know, getting out the barrels of beer and making the most of it, but also for the kids, you know, and they remembered, a lot of them, the food that they had, you know, whether that was jelly or blancmange or, you know, it wasn't until I was researching this book that I really sort of understood what went into organising these street parties, because obviously this is a country under rationing. You know, people have been making do just about for the past 6 years, really. But there was quite a lot of organisation because they knew the end of the war was coming. There were whole sort of team, like local neighbourhood teams. So one woman I interviewed, when she was a girl, she and her dad were responsible for going around all the neighbours and collecting up the money so that they could buy the food for the street party. And someone else was responsible for sort of pooling all the coupons and so on. So it was a real kind of community activity, just putting these amazing parties together. And there's a reason that they have never forgotten them 80 years on.
There's something very moving about standing here at New Haven Fort, where all those preparations would have been going on 80 years ago, and there must have been something quite remarkable for you about hearing those accounts firsthand. We read about them in the history books, but actually speaking to people, seeing their reaction to those memories, seeing them talk about things which have had a long-lasting impact on their life, that must have been quite incredible.
Absolutely, yeah. And as I said, the VE Day story is generally very positive. I mean, I was on the telly this morning with a Blitz kid who was actually up in Edinburgh. And he remembered on VE Day, his dad took him up to Arthur's Seat. So they had this kind of view of the whole city when it got to sort of twilight, sort of evening time, just to watch all the lights coming back on. And so, you know, even things like that we might not think about, you know, for a country that's been in blackout throughout the war, to suddenly be able to put your lights on and rip down the blackout curtains is this kind of magical moment. So I think for a lot of people, VE Day was, you know, it was a very cathartic, very important moment of release as much as an incredible party.
Thank you so much for joining us on the programme, author of The Blitz Kids, and do continue to share your memories as well. We're going to bring you a lot more here from New Haven Fort. It's a special programme celebrating VE Day 80 years ago today. More music now. Let's hear from Nickelback.